morning, good evening, good afternoon, and a general hello to you all. A happy Douglass Week to everyone. A happy Black History Month to everyone watching in the US. And also today, so many reasons to celebrate. A happy Valentine's Day and happy birthday to Frederick Douglass on his chosen birthday. So lots of reasons to celebrate today with a very wonderful panel here with us. My name is Dr. Caroline Schroeder. I'm the founder of Douglass Week, and a very big thank you to you all for tuning in here live on YouTube, but also to our guests today who are joining us for this wonderful panel. And also with me is my amazing colleague and friend, Sarah McCready. She's also a co-founder of Douglass Week. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Caroline. Thanks for the introductions. It's lovely to be with you today. And of course, hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all, to our esteemed panel, to everyone here on YouTube. Thanks for joining us today. Happy Douglass Week, day 5. It's hard to believe it's already day 5. And this week we've been learning about Douglass, about his family and their lives. And we can't wait to hear more from this wonderful group of researchers.
Yes, and I think we're all really excited that you have joined us for this event called Power of the Visual. And we will learn a lot about Frederick Douglass and something that is not always known to a lot of people, his love and his use of photography and general visual art. So we'll learn lots from this wonderful roundtable discussion. A warm hello to our participants, Professor John Stauffer from Harvard University, Professor Celeste-Marie Bernier from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, Professor Maurice Wallace at Rutgers University, and our wonderful host today, Dr. Fionnuala Sweeney at Newcastle University. And we'll hand over to Fionnuala in just a second, but first, just a very short information section about Douglass Week.
Thanks, Caroline. So I'm sure you all know by now that we created Douglass Week to celebrate and commemorate the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, everything he stands for, and of course, other change makers from around the world. But we like to think of Douglass as a jumping off point. We don't only want to commemorate the history of Douglass, his big, wonderful family, but also to discuss the many very contemporary issues of identity, issues of race, independence, and equal rights around the world that come up when you talk and think about Douglass. And with that in mind, we also want to celebrate guiding principles during Douglass Week. These principles are things like connectedness, co-creation, and collaboration that we think all our contributors, partners, and the friends of Douglass Week share.
Yes, and the Douglass community, the Douglass Week community has grown. It's such a transatlantic community now, and we look forward to it growing even more. Grown so much since Douglass Week was kind of established in 2019, so can't wait. And we'll hand over in 1 second now to Fionnuala. Just a last little bit of housekeeping. This event will last about 45 minutes or so. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat on YouTube. We'll monitor that. So if you have any questions, we'll pass them on to the speaker. We also ask everyone please to be respectful. Inappropriate conduct will not be tolerated. That's not part of Douglass Week, so please be respectful to other audience members, but also to our panelists. So thank you very much for being respectful.
Yes, thanks everyone for being respectful. Just for your information, this event and all events throughout Douglass Week will be recorded. So if you miss an event, don't worry, all our events will be available here on YouTube, and you can join us live or rewatch the events during the week and afterwards. So you can find our full program for the week on our website, which is www.douglassweek.org.
Yeah, now get excited, everyone, for this great conversation about to happen about a medium that was really, really important to Frederick Douglass. And I'm particularly looking forward to the photos that we'll see and discuss with you all. So thanks for being here, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you enjoy this next Douglass Week event. And I'll hand over to Fionnuala, John, Maurice, and Celeste now. Thank you for being here, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this panel of some of the foremost scholars and experts on Frederick Douglass who join us today in conversation about Douglass's work in and his significance to visual culture and the visual arts, really from the early stages of his public life, from the 1840s through the 19th century, and we may have a chance to talk a little about his legacy again. We'll be hearing and learning much about his revolutionary image making, about his writing, and about that legacy. We have three, as I said, unparalleled speakers in conversation today. Maurice Wallace is Associate Professor of English at Rutgers University, and he also teaches in areas of visual culture and sound studies. His fields of expertise include African American literature and cultural studies, 19th century American literature, the history and representation of American slavery, and gender studies. He is the author of the groundbreaking book on the history of Black manhood in African American letters and culture called Constructing the Black Masculine, Identity and Ideality in African American Men's Literature and Culture from 1775 to 1995. And he's also co-editor with Sean Michelle Smith of a volume of scholarly articles on early photography and African American identity entitled Pictures and Progress, Early Photography and the Making of African American Identity. Maurice has served on the editorial boards for American Literature and the Yale Journal of Criticism, and is a contributing editor to the James Baldwin Review. His current research and writing projects include a monograph on the religious life and leanings of Frederick Douglass and a critical exploration into the sound of Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice. Celeste-Marie Bernier is Professor of United States and Atlantic Studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. She is the author of over 50 books and essays and curator of over 10 US and UK exhibitions. Her forthcoming books include an Oxford World's Classics edition of Life and Times of Frederick Douglass and the Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass Family Papers, Volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4, the Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass Family Selected Writings, a reader, and Douglass Family Lives, the biography. And if that were not enough, she is the current recipient of a UK Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship Award for her current project, Sacrifice is Survival, Black Families Fighting for Freedom in the USA and Canada, 1732 to 1936. And lastly, John Stauffer is the Sumner Orr and Marshall S. Cates Professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard University and a leading authority on anti-slavery, the Civil War era, social protest movements, and photography. He is the author or editor of 20 books and over 100 articles, including Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, which was a national bestseller. His monograph, The Black Hearts of Men, was the co-winner of the Frederick Douglass Book Prize and the Lincoln Prize second place winner. And the outstanding Picturing Frederick Douglass, co-authored with Celeste-Marie and Zoe Trott, was a Lincoln Prize finalist, and it's difficult to overstate the significance of this book, which provides us with, amongst other things, the catalogue raisonné of Douglass portraiture. John's essays and reviews have appeared in Time, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Washington Post, The Huffington Post, and he has served as a consultant for several films and exhibitions, including Django Unchained, The Free State of Jones, The Abolitionists, and War Photography. John, Celeste, and Maurice, thank you very much for joining us today. Let's get started maybe by getting a little bit of background on what we're talking about when we talk about Douglass and visual culture. Frederick Douglass had a very special interest in the visual arts. Perhaps, John, you could begin by telling us why that was and how it came about. What was the significance of this?
Douglass believed that art and aesthetics were inseparable, really, from reform, from the idea of human rights, of equality under the law for everyone, and of freedom. And Douglass not only sat for his photograph more than any other 19th century American, so far as we know, but he also wrote on photography. And he wrote on photography during the Civil War, at a time in which a number of listeners initially wondered why he was writing on photography in the midst of a war which he was very involved with and had a major stake in, and was an important ally and colleague, really, of the Lincoln administration. But in one of his speeches, he, in my view, kind of encapsulates the significance of photography as it relates to his life's work, which was trying to end slavery and achieve equality under the law for everyone and freedom for everyone. in which he says, poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers. And this ability is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be in the reflection of what is and endeavor to remove the contradiction. And I think it's one of my favorite quotes of Douglass. Douglass is, among other things, in my view, one of the greatest nonfiction writers in the English language. And this line from his speech on photography really highlights the degree to which photography is at its best, not just an artwork, but a means to achieve an understanding of the equality of all humans, the degree to which humans should be treated with equality, and that they should be free. And I would love to know what Maurice and Celeste, if they want to build on that comment. They're both familiar with it. They've both written brilliantly on Douglass and photography and aesthetics.
Who would like to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in here, if that's okay, Celeste. Good to see you both. And thank you, John, for inaugurating this conversation, so to speak, with reference to Douglass's lectures on photography. Your quoting from that lecture has reminded me and surfaced a couple of phrases which I think now I'm hearing as if for the first time, though I've read these lines several times. The idea that Douglass is a poet, prophet, and reformer all at once ought to be something that we tend to more often and more consistently, right? That we're often talking about Douglass as a prophetic figure to the absence of thought about his artistic enterprise or his reform work. We're often talking about his creative works in the absence of any conversation about his, say, religious inclinations or irreligious inclinations and his political work. So I love that you have, in effect, reminded us that part of the genius of Douglass and the and the significant historicity of Douglass lies in the fact that he was at once all three of these figures. And if indeed poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, then we scarcely have a more prolific picture maker than Douglass himself. That's we tend to think of picture makers, obviously, as those who are the operators of cameras. But I love to think about the degree to which Douglass, though a stilled figure in so many photographs, exercise a certain agency in them as well, right? These photographs are not left entirely to a camera's operators to pose him at will, but he is asserting a kind of independence even there. And I think we do well to continue to think along those lines. And I just want to add too that I love that for Douglass, photography was also a function of what felt like a new scientific age, new scientific innovation, right? So that among a great many people, photography was both art and technology at one and the same time, or at least was a form that helped those who were thinking about new technologies to also think about the relationship of that technology or those technologies to art itself. So photography was art and technology, and to the degree that Douglass was invested in artistic production, he was also really, really curious about so many new technologies. And I think that's part of what helped make him such a modern figure for his time.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I think it's really beautiful, and the powerful words you both shared, Maurice and John, are oxygen to my lifeblood, to my heart, and thinking about Frederick Douglass in this way. The beauty of understanding the politics and philosophy of his practice, and his understanding that the battleground, past, present, and future against white supremacy was one that is fought on every front. And understanding that photographs were a political and revolutionary tool in that ongoing struggle. And understanding that pictorial philosophical power that comes from photography. And Maurice, where you talk so beautifully about his involvement in every way, Douglass writes himself, doesn't he, where he says, of my photographs, I am the painter. And it's so powerful. He used that word, that I am the painter. And when he's talking to white racists and supremacists, he says, let everybody to their taste, but let no one trample on human rights. And so that question of the picture as a power and as a transformational portal for pain into revolution stayed with him all his life.
Yes. And it gives agency too to not just Douglass, but any sitter, where he's essentially telling, and photography, Americans had a love affair with photography. Countless people sat for the photograph. He's essentially urging people to say, you have a stake, you have agency in this photograph, in this work of art, and a reform work that comes out of it. That a photograph is a kind of pas de trois, a dance, or a dance, or for three, really, between the sitter, the camera itself, and the technology of the camera, and the photographer, and that be sitting for the image, for the photograph itself, it can be itself empowering at a time in which even in the 19th century and certainly in the 20th century, photography has often been seen as an exploitative form of art or technology.
Thank you all for that. I mean, it's so interesting to think about him in those three roles of poet, prophet, and reformer. But maybe we could return, because there's so many phases to Douglass's work in the visual arts, and his photographic corpus is so large and so long. But he starts somewhere, and I suppose he starts in the 1840s when he's a fugitive, when he has self-emancipated himself, but when he is not yet free, when he is not yet manumitted, and of course, those who are enslaved in the United States are still waiting for that moment when they can be free. So I wonder, perhaps, Celeste, could you talk to us a little bit about how he initiates this photographic project, where he starts with the self-portraiture. What starts to happen? Where are we with this?
Well, I think for Frederick Douglass, and I'm super excited to hear Maurice and John's views on this. I think for Frederick Douglass, as we know, the unparalleled, unprecedented orator, writer, philosopher, and thinker, turns to pictures, as he says, because language fails. And for somebody who is an unprecedented orator of unrivaled power, and whose power over the written and spoken word is unimaginable in any universe, he says language is cold, valueless, and lifeless when it comes to representing the atrocities, abuses, and violences of slavery. And so for Frederick Douglass, images are the moment where language fails. And he sees the visual, as he describes it, as a way of memorializing the life of Frederick Douglass that he creates in a world that is no freedom at all, versus the life of Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, who lived 2 decades of his life on a labor camp in the US South. So for Frederick Douglass, the visual is a weapon, it's a memorial, and in his photographs, his preoccupation is one that is so powerfully expressed by him, where he says, I share the inner via the outer man. So Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey enters the room with Frederick Douglass in his photographs. And the purpose and power of Frederick Douglass's oratory, his writings, and his pictures was, as he always said, to represent
to remember, to recreate the lives across the Black diaspora, lost and fought, won in the battleground of freedom. And he often said that in remembering and memorializing my face in my pictures, I'm doing justice to those who died and the stories and the pictures that cannot be seen and cannot be told.
Thanks, Celeste. Maurice, are you coming in there?
I think so. I wanted to also propose that Douglass's images, his portraits in particular, were already always counter images to a kind of violence on Black people, and a violence done to the representation of Black people. And one can only imagine the degree to which Douglass's elegance, his urbaneness, his very clear character in these images, if you will, were a counter to obviously a weapon in the way that Celestia has indicated, but also their strength, their force lies significantly in their opposition, their resistance to the popularization of so many hyperbolized, caricatured, violent images of Black people. One thinks of those 1850 images of Louis Agassiz, of the slave daguerreotypes, right? How often might Douglass have imagined his own production as antithetical to, a counter to, a corrective to, and one that would be, of course, a set of images that would, of course, endure beyond Agassiz's images, so to speak. And leave with us an enduring and lasting impression. I think that is a significant part of the power of these images and their reception in Douglass's day. It's enough for us, removed from that period, to marvel at these images and to admire them. But I think Celeste is right to call us back to the immediacy of those images and the kind of cultural, political work, the anti-Black cultural, political work those images were doing in their day. I am convinced that part of our work as scholars is to keep that context ever before viewers of Douglass's photographs.
It's great. I love what both Maurice, you and Celeste said. I would just add, Celeste, I would push back a little bit about your point about words fail for Douglass. Douglass was, as you all know, one of the greatest autobiographers, and he wrote in multiple genres. As a journalist, he edited the longest running African-American newspaper. He wrote many of his speeches. He delivered them orally. He wrote fiction. He wrote poetry. He published fiction, poetry. And as a speaker and as a writer and as a picture maker, he recognized that each of these genres, I think, had particular strengths and weaknesses. And so it's not as though they failed at times, but it's just they weren't as effective as other genres. And as a picture maker sitting for his photographs, based on his writings, he recognizes the degree to which a photograph can capture, can evoke, and can realize the equal and essential humanity of the sitter, of the individual, in a way that writing is more difficult to do, in a way that oratory is more difficult to do. And so there is, and I think he was brilliant at choosing each of these media that he was stunning at and using it in their appropriate and proper place. In that sense, as an aesthetician, as someone who understands the limits and possibilities of words on a page, the limits and possibilities of a speech, the limits and possibility of a photograph. I think he is a philosopher of aesthetics, the limits and possibility of religion. I think he is a philosopher as well.
Thanks, John. I wonder, Gavin, could we have the first picture of Douglass? Because I think it would actually help to have sight of some of these images. And Maurice, to pick up on your comments about these photographs as counters to caricature, to stereotype, to racialized images, to other things that are circulating and being manipulated in the sphere of representation. I wonder if any of you would like to open up the conversation on this particular extraordinary photograph from Douglass's early career.
I suppose it bears remark that Douglass's investment in these images was not only in a proper representation of Black humanity, but in a proper representation of Black citizenship. And I think what we are witness to here is Douglass as an embodiment of Black American citizen, deservedly so, and that this image was not only could not only afford him to reflect his own confidence about Black sort of deservedness of citizenship rights, but I think offers a picture to the nation of the assimilability of Black people into the body politic at large. Here is Douglass as a proper man. And I think that is a significant representation, and it can hardly be denied in this image.
Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful, Maurice, and I think it just makes me think of the words that Frederick Douglass says later, doesn't he? Where he says, through photography, men of all conditions can see themselves as others. And beautifully what you were saying too about the war against white racist, derogatory, dehumanizing images. And as we know, his lifelong commitment to ensuring they were in none of his publications, his legal fight with the publishers, the white supremacists who were publishing Life and Times, who, as he said, wanted to reproduce gross and shocking woodcuts that are caricatures of my face. And there's numerous letters where he's saying, I will not let this go forward. I will take you to court if you publish this in this way. So the battleground of the fight against what these images, the work they're doing in the world and the revolutionary work they're doing in the world carries very much close to Douglass's heart and vision.
Completely agree with that. Both of what you said. I see Douglass as just in this photograph and some of the photographs, but this was a beautiful one. I mean, dress was important to Americans, and how one appeared, how one spoke, and as a subject in photography, as a speaker, as a writer. I mean, just to echo what you said, Maurice, Douglass out-citizens white citizens at their own game. He beats them at their own game, time and again.
Indeed.
And
Indeed.
He does that in photographs. He does it in writing. I mean, there's Stephen Douglass, the Illinois racist senator. Right after Frederick Douglass becomes famous, Stephen Douglass, until that time, had spelled his last name with 2 S's. And I haven't found a smoking gun, but I think plausibly a reason why Stephen Douglass deleted 1 S is because we know that there are a number of journalists, particularly on the East Coast, who confused Frederick Douglass with Stephen Douglass. And an outrage. Frederick Douglass has out-citizened this U.S. senator at his own game.
I wonder if we look at this photo. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, too, to return quickly to my mention of the Louis Agassiz's daguerreotypes, that Douglass's sartorial sensibilities here ought to be seen as a counterpoint to the nearly nude images, which were, of course, intended to animalize those enslaved persons who are figured in those infamous images that we know of today, but were hidden from us for so many decades. Again, it seems to me that it would be a fruitful exercise for us to think about Douglass as constructing images in counterpoint to the kinds of images that Agassiz made infamous.
Yes, another great point. That's a great point. I agree.
So incredibly powerful, Maurice, what you've just said. And it also makes me think of the artistry and authorship and activism that Mr. Frederick Douglass is creating here. And we also have Rosetta Douglass Spragg at the age of 7, which is his eldest daughter, what she would have been at the time of this image. And she made her first shirt for her father at Anna Murray Douglass's expert direction at that period. And Anna Murray Douglass herself, a beautiful, inspirational dressmaker, seamstress, expert in all the arts with textile design. We have more than one artist here.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning both those women as well, because even in images where Douglass is seated alone, their influence is somehow present. Their work, their activism is reflected, is in the shadows, if you will, of those images.
Thank you. Beautiful.
This is this wonderful images from, I suppose, the earlier part of Douglass's career, but it's pre-Civil War. Is there any tension between what is represented and what is really going on here? If we say that this is an image of citizenship, of the potential of citizenship, is there anything else that's going on behind the scenes here in this photograph, I wonder?
Well, one thing that's going on behind the scenes, it's a part of the context, is that a large number of daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, carte de visites, particularly in photographer studios, there's a lot of tables and chairs and backdrops. So the attention is less on the person and more on the room itself. And Douglass, in essentially 167 and counting separate photographs, Douglass, the vast majority of the time, the focus is on himself. So he's drawing attention to the humanity, this human being who is and this citizen, without encouraging or allowing people to look at the wall or all the material that is in the photographs. And there's one that we'll come to that he's taken during the Civil War. And when there is a prop in there, the prop is significant. We're not showing it, but one prop is after the war, when Lincoln is assassinated, Mary Todd gives Douglass his walking stick, and as a memento, if really in a sense, for the role that Douglass plays in the war and in convincing Lincoln to become more radical. And so there's a photograph of Douglass showing just a very small part, a tiny part, like a 20th% of the frame is taken out by the edge of Douglass's or Lincoln's walking stick that Douglass owns. And so that's when there is a prop, those props matter.
Thanks, John. It might be useful to have a look at that photograph you were speaking of, John, the Civil War photograph. Gavin, if we could have it up on the screen, please. Thank you. Hey, this looks like almost a different person. It's a very different character. Yes. What do people think?
So this is during 1863, and so this is one of the few where you see a prop. You see a book on the table. He's wearing a long gown. There's a tablecloth over it. So you see him. It looks he presents himself, among other things, as a scholar, a reader, an intellectual, as well as a citizen. The other point that people, if you're not familiar with Douglass's photographs, you see that the difference in his facial hair. Douglass continually experimented with his sartorial style, with his facial hair, with the length of his hair. And in that sense, and in my view, and you see some of it in his writings, Douglass recognized the importance of continually evolving and seeking new and better heights of humanity, as it were. And as a former enslaved person, in one sense, I think Douglass's idea of a self, of a human continually and continual evolution, continual flux, reflects his experience as an enslaved person, in which slavery is based on fixity. It's based on a human being being fixed at a position, and the goal of the slave owner, of the master, is to prevent that other human being from evolving in any way at all, in any form at all. And so Douglass, envisioning humans as continually evolving and growing intellectually, emotionally, physically, in every way, explodes the very bases of both slavery and racism.
I think that's right, John. I really appreciate you saying that. And we can only imagine the challenge of articulating that kind of philosophy when evolution itself is emergent as a science, right? Yes. So how do you on the one hand make certain kinds of claims for human evolution without falling into traps of racial science, of racial pseudoscience that would allow for a certain kind of evolution, but a different sort of evolution for persons of African descent than persons of European descent. And it's a complicated kind of discourse to engage, I imagine. There's a tightrope, I think, he has to walk here. But I agree with you firmly. And from this image to images later in his life, I think that we witness in images, in photographs, in portraiture, this evolution in practice. Yeah. And I think you're quite on point and eloquent to point out the difference between this image and the former one, which is a demonstration of a certain evolution of practice and thought on Douglass's part. Mm.
I think there's a very powerful point that maybe just even thinking of the bridges between all these different beautiful ideas and beautiful images is the way in which Douglass understands how political human rights equality happens in practice versus in theory. And one of the powerful statements he makes, doesn't he, where he says, pictures and other symbolical representations, including images, and these are his direct words, speak to the imagination. Yes. And so the world in which Frederick Douglass, the political subject, becomes the philosophical empowered figure through the transformation of the imaginary. And as he fights against white, as he says, you know, I was bought and sold on the auction blocks of the US South, but I was bought and sold in white anti-slavery ideology by racists, but in any other name. And so I think for Douglass, the ways in which he fights against the white racist language around his identity and his representation, or the counter images you were speaking to as well, Maurice, is very much at the heart about what is happening in the imagination when people look at his pictures too.
That's very good. Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. And Douglass realized that imagination, I mean, he says that he, I mean, in a sense, is still remains accurate. And in one of his speeches on photography, says that essentially only humans have the capacity for imagination, to think outside of the present, to reflect on the past, to articulate, to imagine a future and try to realize it. And according to biologists, in fact, I've interviewed them. Douglass is accurate. There are, based on the arguably primitive ways of trying to understand the cognitive capacities of other animals, whether it's horses or whatever, that there's no evidence that other animals have the capacity to reflect and think outside of the present moment. So in that sense, Douglass's understanding of humans, all humans being equal in their capacity, the power that all humans have of imagination, I think remains resonant. It's not to take away from animal rights cases. It's just that humans are different from other species, just as every other species is different from other species.
Perhaps we could turn to the last photograph that we have today, which is a photograph of Douglass, unusually not looking straight at the camera, and in his private space. Maurice, would you like to open up on this one?
Happy to. I don't think we could have selected 3 more representative images of the evolution of Douglass than we see in these images. If you think about the ways that John described the previous image with the introduction of props, a book, into the view of the camera, and we acknowledge his further point that there's a difference between the camera that in the very first image that is tightly fixed on Douglass's face and at somewhat of a further remove from his face in the second image, then we don't get his face at all in this image, which I think is, around the 1880s. It's not altogether clear. And of course, I've relied on John and Celeste to give me that information. But I'm fascinated with this image because it is a certain kind of it's strikingly different than the pose that Douglass bears elsewhere. The degree to which this was designed is hard to know. But I want to observe not only the myriad books that now occupy the scene from the single book that was in the previous image. If the previous image represents Douglass, as John says, as a scholar, I want to suggest that this image, among other things, offers him as a deep thinker. That one imagines that he is not only sort of reading, but processing, and perhaps even at work, writing, composing, putting on the page this the thoughts that are inspired by so many books. I'm fascinated by this image, not just because of the books, of course, but because of any number of things that that are almost foregrounded, while Douglass himself is nearly backgrounded in this text. And among the things that have captured my own imagination include, of course, the profile portrait of Douglass himself on the wall, and the many others who are featured there in smaller frames alongside him. But the violin that sits on the desk, and I have to admit that I'd probably seen this image 100 times before I took notice to the violin. And it sort of appeared one day looking on this image, and opened up for me any number of new possibilities for thinking about not just Douglass and his relationship, say, to music, his relationship to sound, but the relationship of photography to sound. I've been really thinking long and hard about some of the, philosophy and critical Black theory advanced by Fred Moulton at New York University. And he has helped me to think about the ways in which photography might be said to be defined by its repression of sound, right? And to the degree that it absolutely represses sound, it therefore pronounces sound at the same time. So I'm really interested in this violin. I'm interested in the violin as a kind of relic of the plantation past, one way of nodding to a certain kind of non-print history that might also inform Douglass's aesthetic sensibilities. We know that his grandson became an accomplished international violinist. And then I have to sort of remark on his mastiff in the lower right corner, his pet, right? And I might push back just a bit, John, on the differentiation of, or to put it differently, I might suggest that in this image, I can't help but wonder if Douglass has had to think about the category of the human itself, right? And the relationship of the human to other animals. Here is likely a really fond and close relationship, and it has to mean something. I wonder if our imagining of the uniqueness of human imagination has more to say about the limits of our capacity to measure that in other species.
I think that's a magnificent point. That's a magnificent point. In fact, after I talked about having interviewed scientists or biologists who do the physical research, I think that is a brilliant point, Maurice. So
it's worth thinking about the relationship of enslaved and formerly enslaved persons with animals, and the domestication of dogs and cats in particular. It's not until the middle of the 19th century that the domestication of dogs and as occupants of the domestic American scene, as inhabitants of the parlor, gets popularized. And so I'm really, really interested in Frank, this mastiff, the relationship of dogs to dogs in the 19th century and Black people in the 19th century, and since, and the history that both brings animals and Blacks together and compels Blacks and animals apart from one another. It's a really interesting history to try to map, and I'm hoping that the two of you will have some insight on image or think with me about it, because here's an occasion for me to tap your brains and imagination about what's happening in this image and how very different it is from so many other of the more iconic images of Douglass.
I think in this image, it's the gallery, Douglass's curator and choreographer.
Yes. I love that.
I love everything you both beautifully said, just in the tiny amount we have. He's curated an exhibition of Black excellence through Henry Highland Garnet, through Sengbe Pei, through all the figures that are on the walls, and the history of Black heroism in his relationship to mastiffs, especially. The Anna Murray Douglass family, working at the Underground Railroad from the 40s in Rochester through Lynn, always had a team of mastiffs, and they were a part of, Douglass described it, my army against white racism and white hatred. So that idea about the battleground of the home and the preservation of domesticity and Black domesticity, and that as a battleground of liberation for people coming through from slavery, but also preserving liberty in the North.
Thank you. I agree. That's lovely. Douglass as curator, as gallerist. This is a beautiful sort of representation of that. I love that.
I do too. The other thing that I noticed, I love this image. I mean, this is a formalist point that I'm making, is that you have Douglass, the back of his head in the center of the image. And for me, there's this really, really beautiful and powerful diagonal where you go up to Douglass's portrait, which is profile, and down. There's almost a straight line from his mastiff, and you see the mastiff's eyes.
That's
you
good.
See one in a little bit of the other eye. You see one and I think a little bit of other Douglass's eyes. So there's this beautiful connectedness between Douglass with his back to us and his head and his mastiff and his portrait, as well as the other portraits around it, the books, of course. But I think formally this is a masterpiece of curatorial work.
You've also alerted me suddenly, John, to the fact that half of the image is dedicated to print and the other half is dedicated to image, right? If you divide the image in half. But that's just following the formalist logic that you just offered. So thank you for that.
That's great. I love it.
You know what's happening here. We're getting to the end of time and you're warming up even more.
Just warming up, right.
Yes. Listen, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for such a provocative and interesting conversation, which I really hope that we can recommence or continue next year. But for now, thank you very much, Celeste, John, and Maurice, for joining us, for taking the time to share your thoughts and for really opening up another aspect of the world of Frederick Douglass for us. Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is beautiful.
Thank you.